Hello everyone, welcome to part 3 of behaviorism, functional psychology, or whatever you want to call it. So, behaviorism and ACT. I've never presented about ACT before, I've presented about behaviorism a lot before, so let's just give it a go and see how we do. So, picking up around where Jan left off, I want to flag for you guys that there will be some duplication of our presentations. This is definitely not by accident, because we didn't talk beforehand. It's actually an intentional effort to give you multiple exemplars of the content so that you can learn it even better. Okay, so an overview of what I'm going to talk about in general. First of all, I'll very briefly run through the cognitive lens of looking at different psychological phenomena, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. Then I'll talk about the behaviorist lens, so a different way of looking at it, and in particular explore this idea that naming does not equal explaining, which is very controversial. Then we'll talk about why Skinner was innocent and perfect, but not perfect. Then I'll get into behaviorism and language in particular, which is where Jan left off. So around that idea of stimulus equivalence and relational responding. And I'll do that in the context of this theory of behavioral theory of language called relational frame theory, featuring The Simpsons. And finally, I'll talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, its links to relational frame theory, and yeah, I'll tell you all about lemon suffering and the anxiety monster. And there's going to be some practical demonstrations, so no laptops allowed, you've got to pay full attention the whole time. Okay, so I'm also going to just follow myself here because I've got a couple of notes. So you guys have heard about virtual reality, no doubt. Everyone knows that you can take this headset, put it on your head, and you're brought into an entirely different world where a lot of the rules don't apply that we normally have in everyday life. And the thing with viewing the world scientifically is that we can do this too in terms of our scientific analysis. And how we view the world, the lenses or glasses that we wear, makes a big difference. So we kind of have a few different ways of looking at the world. You guys are probably most familiar with one way in particular, which is the cognitive way of viewing the world. So let's walk through an example related to this. So there's a 16-year-old boy, Joris, who learns that vomiting is an involuntary response to illness. He hears a story in the news about a young man who choked on vomit during his sleep and died. He becomes obsessed with getting ill and vomiting. He avoids anyone who appears to be sick at school. His friends wonder why he isn't talking to them. Joris carries hand sanitizer around everywhere he goes. He avoids public restrooms. He won't touch food that he thinks might be contaminated. He avoids restaurants that he used to enjoy with his family. He goes to the clinic and he's diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. Okay, so this is a pretty familiar clinical kind of case. Now, when we diagnose Joris with OCD, we're making certain assumptions. We're bringing a certain way of viewing human behavior in the world to bear. So, in other words, we ask ourselves things like, what should we study to understand Joris's behavior? How should we do this? And why do we think that we should do this? So, obviously, this is a lot, but from the mental mechanistic perspective, or the cognitive perspective, we have some pre-analytic assumptions that we bring into this analysis. So we would say that there's a mind, there's a thing that we call a mind, that's somewhere inside of us and has mental mechanisms, and these mental mechanisms influence how we behave. In other words, they're these hypothetical machines that have different parts, relationships, operating conditions, and most critically, they mediate between the environment and behavior. So there's some environmental input, there's some mechanistic event, and then there's behavioral input. So when we view the world in this way, we view clinical problems in this way, the purpose of the scientist or the clinician is to construct and validate models of these mental machines. So to understand what are these parts, how do they work, and how can we basically understand how they interact with the environment and how they produce behavior. And by understanding this, we can then go about trying to change that machine, which then should have a downstream impact on behavior. So the unit of analysis from this mental mechanistic perspective is the mental machine, the mental mechanism, whatever we want to call it, the cognitive representation. So that's definitely one way of examining, kind of behavior. There's one scientific lens we can wear. And you might hear things like, I rarely leave the house because if I do, then I'll become contaminated, I'll get sick, and I'll vomit. And when we examine things like this, we might say that the client statement reflects the presence of erroneous or faulty beliefs about the world. So the mental mechanism or the cognitive representation, however you want to call it, is an erroneous belief about how the world works, and this is mediating the environmental input and the behavioral output. So under these assumptions, it's pretty logical that our interventions would end up looking like trying to target these faulty beliefs. That's what CBT and a lot of other modern therapies do. They get at these kind of irrational beliefs and they try to change them. They try to confront them with evidence that will, kind of have a logical impact and change what you believe. Sorry. So, critically, then, the first thing we care about is the belief. That's the first part of our analysis. The behavior comes kind of second. There's a downstream impact of changing this belief on behavior, but it's not where our analysis is ultimately situated. Now, let's put on the behavior analytics. I realized I had those at the start. I was like, that'll be fun. The world from a behavior analytic lens instead. So, what are the pre-analytic assumptions that we might bring in with a behaviorist lens? Firstly, we define people or understand behavior in terms of what they do and not what they are. So, things like obsessive compulsive disorder, being an extrovert or having depression, we can talk about the world in this way, but for behaviors, that's not where our scientific analysis starts. It's not denying that people have distressful experiences, it's just the thing that we're studying is what they're doing, how they're acting, how they're behaving. So behavior is an action that takes place in a context, and this hits on what Jan was saying before about the inherently contextual nature of basically everything. And to change behavior then, we need to identify how past and present context triggers and maintains specific behaviors. So the functional relation between behavior and the environment. So then in that case, the purpose of the scientist, or the purpose of the clinician, in this case, is to predict and influence with precision, so accuracy, scope, broadness, and depth, so that we have a deep understanding of what's happening. So, yeah, to help ourselves create meaningful lives. We all want to do that, of course. And then the unit of analysis, we can call it the act in context, or just the behavior in the context. So the unit of analysis then is the behavior, not the proposed mental mechanisms. So, does anyone have any questions so far? Is everything clear? Is there anything? Okay. So this is basically a core distinction between behaviorism and cognitive psychology. It's the unit of analysis, where our analysis kind of ultimately wants to go. Now, for the behaviorist, one of the big contentions against the mental mechanistic approach is this idea that I already mentioned, that naming is not explaining. So let's take another example. We've got Mareke here, who's very, very sad. So she says, never been someone who feels comfortable in big groups. If I see someone I know when I'm out in town, I become really anxious, I start to walk the other direction. I mean, what if they want to talk to me? And the worst part is, I never know what people think of me. They must think I'm mad or strange or weird or that I have something wrong. But I'm not, I just lack self-esteem. If I could get more self-esteem, then I know my life will be way easier. So, by saying I just lack self-esteem, this might feel like an explanation, but from a behaviorist perspective, we would say this is not an explanation, it's a re-description of what's happening. It's merely naming the phenomenon, but it's not explaining it. Because Mareke says that she lacks self-esteem, but how could we tell that she lacks self-esteem? Anyone? From behavior. So we observe her behaving in specific ways, but if you said we can look at her behavior, which you would, what is it that causes those behaviors? Anyone?
Of course, you're implying that it's circular and you're explaining the surface thing.
Exactly. It's circular reasoning. It's a re-description of the phenomenon rather than an explanation for the phenomenon. And when you do this, you end up in strange situations where you start having very deep ontological debates about, well, what truly is self-esteem? When the reality is, self-esteem as a term originated from a description of the behavior, but it's not an explanation, at least for the behaviors. Yeah.
I know that behaviors like to use this argument, but it's one that I don't agree with myself.
Okay.
I think if cognitive people say she lacks self-esteem, this enters a whole bunch of other assumptions. Like there is a particular mental representation involved. This mental representation could be changed by doing that and that. I can't go into the specific example, but I'm pretty sure well aware of the nature of circular reasoning. What they see as an advantage is that if they bring to bear a certain cognitive construct, that there is a theory attached to that that provides new ideas of influencing.
Well, if you're a cognitive person, I suppose the behaviors would pretend that your ultimate goal is not to influence the behavior, but to understand and influence the mechanism. Whereas from this perspective, you would say that the proposal of the mechanism in itself is just the redescription of the phenomenon, rather than, but it's just a different way of looking at it too.
Yeah. My point is that cognitive people are not threatened by behaviorism. I don't think any cognitive person will accept that problem.
Well, in this specific case, what I think is, for example, that self-esteem is actually can be measured separately than the other symptoms. For example, just how evaluation, qualitative evaluation, like from good to bad of yourself, is different than, for example, having social phobia and being comfortable alone and blah blah blah, which is all different and separate.
But then self-esteem is something different again. It's not a collection of these things. It's really something separate.
Yes. I mean, separate because it's, I mean, at least it's a latent variable, of course, that you cannot directly observe, but the set of manifestation that you link to self-esteem and the set of manifestation that you link to the other things that you hold as behaviors that are, dysfunctional, are different.
But I suppose in this example, what's happened is you inferred the absence of this self-esteem through the behavior, and but you know what, like, I hear what you're saying, but what I would say then is that that is just merely another scale. It's not an explanatory variable. So then there's still a causal assumption, and my point is about the causal assumption. And the causal assumption is, well, as behaviorists would argue, but maybe it's not the case, I don't know. The causal assumption isn't supported. Like saying she lacks self-esteem from a behavioral perspective, at least, is not an explanation for why somebody's doing something.
The way I would represent is that in the she lacks self-esteem, there are arrows going out and arrows coming in. So by putting self-esteem there, you link this behavior with a whole bunch of other knowledge and predictions. So calling it lack of self-esteem, that's heuristic value because it does more than explain she acts the way that she does. It allows you to understand this in a bigger picture and also to make new predictions. So then, only then will a cognitive person say this has value. If it's nearly circular, every cognitive person will say, of course, this does not value. But because there are things, other determinants of self-esteem, and because the lack of self-esteem predicts other behaviors, there's more than circularity.
Then what I would say in response then is that that is effectively getting at the place where behaviorists ultimately end up with, except they arrive there from learning histories rather than additional constructs.
I think so, yeah.
I'm only giving the cliches.
Yeah, but I think given the audience, I think it's important to make that point that I don't think the value of behaviorism depends on pointing out this false limitation of psychology.
Sure. Okay. Well, then let me recontextualize it by saying this characterization, for whether it's accurate or not, is part of the rationale by which behaviorism rejects explanatory constructs.
That is true, and it's because of, I would say, incorrect arguments like this creates animosity.
Absolutely, and so I meant to say this at the start. Some of the stuff that's in this it's not inflammatory, but it's definitely like maybe will have a bit of a, you might have a bit of a reaction to it, but I'm trying to convey an alternative perspective. And I'm trying to do it in a non-combative way, but also in a way that's engaging. So if anything comes across as being like I'm having a go at anybody else, that's not my intention at all, and I'm very sorry. Okay? Letting it slide. Okay. So let's skip past this because this is just the broad point that I'm trying to make, which is that for the behavior analyst, they don't find naming as a type of explanation satisfying. One of the other key aspects of this is this point, which is that it doesn't point us towards effective interventions. From a behavioral perspective, the behavior analyst wants to know what in the environment can I intervene upon that can then have an impact on behavior. And this naming doesn't, for the behavior analyst, provide that kind of information in the most direct way possible, let's say. So, surely if we can name something, it must exist, is something that you often hear. Here comes one of those inflammatory slides, by the way. So we have terms like memory, attention, beliefs, etc., etc. And surely the fact that we qualitatively experience these things and we have names for them, they must have scientific status. We must surely be able to include them in a scientific analysis as explanatory variables. To which many behaviorists will reply, beholds a unicorn. We have a name for it, so that's the inflammatory part. But there are other better examples that are related to this point. Things like the phlogiston theory in chemistry, which is Noel's theory that assumed there was this source called phlogiston, which was responsible for the combustion of objects. Obviously, ego, super-ego, and also this feeling of vibes, which this seems like it's a joke, but a lot of, especially younger people now, talk about things in terms of vibes. There's whole kind of subfields of pseudoscience-y studies of vibrations, but also things like the commonly accepted term impetus from physics, which was used to describe the motion of objects, and then things like the four humors, etc., etc. The point is, merely having a name for something and it feeling truthy does not necessarily mean that it has status within a scientific analysis. Again, this is the point behaviorists make in general. And the usual reaction we have is that these things do feel like they are real. We all have the qualitative experience of, my memory, I have this memory, I'm paying attention, I believe this thing. But one thing that's important to note is that there's a difference between memory and remembering. There's a difference between attention and paying attention or attending. And there's a difference between having a belief and believing. The latter things in these comparisons are verbs. The former things are nouns. For the behaviorist, we say human beings are verbs. They do things. They don't have these things. And by saying that we have these things, we impose explanatory mechanisms that for the behaviorists don't really have any foundation. So, of course, it's important to say also that behaviorists acknowledge these private actions, like nobody's going to disagree that we all have the experience of remembering, but it just doesn't assume that the cause of these things, the cause of these private events, is internal. It rejects these hypothetical constructs as a root cause. And this is the fundamental difference, really, between a cognitive approach and a behavioral approach. So the question then might be, well, I've heard that behavior analysts reject private events. I've heard that behaviorists don't believe in things like emotion, attention, things like this. And it's not really true. So behaviorists, there are a lot of different flavors of behaviorism. And the most common characterization of behaviorism is something like we reject these kind of ideas. But that's actually a specific form of behaviorism called methodological behaviorism, which is Watson's kind of SR behaviorism from the 1910s and 20s. Skinner founded a type of behaviorism called radical behaviorism, which explicitly includes in its analysis private events, thoughts, feelings. It doesn't assume that the root cause of behavior, but it also acknowledges that people have these experiences and they should be part of our scientific analysis. So this is one big thing that happens. We confuse methodological and radical behaviorism. In this book of Skinner, he actually points out some of these things, what he calls common misunderstandings of behaviorism. So it ignores consciousness and feelings and states of mind. It does not attempt to account for cognitive processes. It is no place for intention or purpose. It assigns no role to a self or a sense of self, and it dehumanizes man and is reductionistic and destroys man upon man. And also, it's indifferent to the warmth and richness of human life, and it is incompatible with the creation of enjoyment of art, music, and literature. So, if you ever get time to read something leisurely, I encourage you to read this book. For me, it's very illuminating on what radical behaviorism is and isn't. But then, anyway, at this point, the distinction between methodological and radical behaviorism is an important one. And radical behaviorism acknowledges these things, it just doesn't attribute them as the root cause of behavior. The root cause is the environment. Just repeating myself. I repeated myself again. So this is the point. Behaviorism assumes that the history of learning, in terms of antecedents and consequences, impacts how people respond to their current environment. In other words, behavior is a function of past antecedents and consequences. So therefore, interventions from a behavioral perspective should be situated in the environment. So rather than focusing on changing faulty beliefs, it should be situated at the level of changing the history of learning. So introducing new exemplars that lead to new learning experiences that change how the organism interacts with their environment. And they use behavioral principles like reinforcement, punishment, extinction. Jan's gone through these. And the key thing then as well, which Jan also mentioned already, is that the criterion for truth in behavior analysis is not any kind of realist sense of discovering the true structure of the mind or discovering the true nature of human behavior. It's about prediction and influence. In behavior analysis, what is true is what works. It's a very pragmatic philosophy of science. So if I can say, for example, like the examples that Jan gave, I have an SD that reliably impacts behavior, then that is an SD functionally. Am I making sense, Julia? You look confused? It's okay? All right. So here's one example of this. In the presence of a particular teacher, a child in school cries when they're presented with work to do. So when they do this, the teacher comes along and removes the work from their desk. Now, you might say, and this isn't necessarily an explanation from a cognitive perspective, I'm just trying to illustrate differences. You might say that the child doesn't like doing the work, or the child believes that crying will express how they're feeling and the teacher will react to this. There's stuff to do with belief, stuff to do with liking. A behavioral explanation, and then you notice that this analysis is situated at the level of the mental mechanism. It's about liking, it's about believing, etc., etc. Your intervention that comes from this will probably involve an arrow overlapping text and have something to do with changing the child's beliefs about the teacher's behavior. So we might want to teach the child that, no, actually, the work isn't so bad, or no, the teacher really will make them feel good if you do this, or any myriad of other kinds of intervention. For a behavior analyst, in this example, the behaviorist explanation is that in the presence of work, an aversive stimulus, the child has learned that crying reliably leads to an escape from the aversive context. So, the antecedent is work, the behavior is crying, and the consequence is the removal of the work. So there's a functional relationship between the behavior and the consequences. And you call this negative reinforcement. The removal of a stimulus increases the frequency of behavior in the future. So from this lens, then you would say the behavior, you've got this ABC relationship, antecedent behavior consequence, or as Jan said, the SD, the response, and the SR. And then the solution from a behavioral perspective then is to try to change the antecedent to consequence, or maybe differentially reinforce alternative behaviors. So for example, provide reinforcement for sitting still, provide an ability to emit this kind of escape response, but to just do it maybe in a more socially appropriate manner. So instead of crying, the child can raise their hand and say, could I please not do this work? And if they do that, they get the book to do. Is this all clear so far? Another example, which is very relevant because I had this conversation with some colleagues quite recently, is in terms of growth mindset. Have you guys heard of this? Okay, so if anyone doesn't know it, growth mindset is basically the idea that you can approach problems with either a fixed mindset, where you believe that your ability to tackle this task is kind of fixed and you can't really learn, or a growth mindset, where you approach challenges as an opportunity to learn. And the idea is that if you have a growth mindset, then it leads to better outcomes, that you perseverate more tasks, things like this. And oh, don't have any more. We were talking about this in the context of a study that they were planning on running, and just generally talking about growth mindset. And they sort of said, well, we want to increase growth mindset. So they came at it from what I would consider to be this kind of mental mechanistic perspective, where there is a growth mindset belief that mediates the relationship between the environment and behavior. And the intervention that they arrived at was that they provided these school kids with vignettes that basically described the benefits of having a growth mindset, described why it's important to have these things and how it can benefit you in the long term. And as you guys probably know, growth mindset interventions like this, and a lot of them look like that, they're not very effective at all. It's the usual kind of trendy literature where you've got a few big results and then a lot of null or very small effect sizes. To give where a behaviorist would come from on this, the behaviorist would say, what history of learning has led to this growth mindset in the first place? What previous environmental events, antecedents, and consequences have led to arriving at this point? And then, if you're going to create an intervention, ideally, your intervention looks like the same history of learning that brought you to the fixed mindset or the growth mindset in the first place. Now, that requires a much bigger analysis, because you have to kind of follow children maybe along a developmental trajectory, find out what happens in the school environment or the home environment that leads to children having one set of belief or another. But the point is, the intervention now is no longer focused on changing the belief per se. Instead, it's focused on finding out what history of learning brought you to that point and adapting your intervention to look similar to that same history of learning. Yeah.
I'm not sure whether we are talking here about a research framework or a psychotherapy framework. Like, you want to know what the history of learning is for people in general or your patients in general?
So could you ask it again?
So, I'm referring to the possibility of investigating history of learning, typical history of learning of children, or you have a patient that you want to know?
It depends on your problem.
Okay.
If it's something, so like say for example with kids in school, there have been a bunch of kind of analyses done on individual children already, and from those multiple analyses, behavior analysis analysts have kind of induced that there are usually two main functions of behavior in the context, like in terms of disruptive behavior in schools. So it's usually either for attention or escape. So it's either to get attention from peers or a teacher, or it's to escape from an aversive work context and things like this. And because the school environment is relatively consistent for most kids, you can make kind of more general assumptions then about what interventions typically will need to look like. But of course, especially as we get to like verbally able adults who have a longer history of learning in more contexts with far more exemplars and things like this, you then kind of need to cater interventions to specific individuals. The idea with behavior analysis is that you abstract principles as much as possible, but also there's always an individual's learning history that needs to be accounted for. Okay. I hope this example helps clarify it a bit more. So I can't go into all of these, but the point is as well that behavior analysis has a bunch of tools, because it's very pragmatically focused. So these are all tools that behavior analysts use to try to intervene in the environment. And you actually probably recognize some of them, like token economies. We all live in the world. We all know that money controls our behavior. Well, this is just an example of a very large-scale token economy, where a token, namely cash, is used as a conditioned reinforcer, which then leads us to engage in other behaviors, even though money has no intrinsic reinforcing value. I can't get into all of this because it would require an entire lecture series, but One thing that I do want to talk about a bit more, because it brings us towards verbal behavior, which then brings us towards ACT, is this manned, tact, interverbal, and echoic training. So now I'm going to give you the history portion. The first behavioral conception of language was Skinner's in his radical behaviorism, and it's centered around these ideas. So what do these things mean? Because you've probably not seen most of them before, but they're basically like technicalizations of everyday terms, just trying to create scientific terminology. So manned basically describes a behavior whose function is to gain access to stimulus. So for example, me saying, Julio, could you pass me that glass of water? I'm manding for the water. But also, this can be nonverbal too. So for example, if I see my kid going like this and reaching for a toy, if the function of the behavior is to gain access to that and it's reliably reinforced, then this is also a mand. It's a behavior whose function is to gain access to a stimulus. And there's tacting. Tacting is essentially just labeling our own experiences or objects in the environment. So if I point to this and I say, not glass, but cup, that's a tact. If I point to this and I say sunglasses, this is tact. So the function of the behavior is to label the stimulus. Then we have introverbals, which are basically just talking to people. It's verbal behavior that's under the control of another person's verbal behavior. So Julio says to me, how are you? I say, I'm fine. My response is an introverbal. Your initial saying, how are you, is more like a mand. You're manding maybe for social attention and specific social information. And then we have echoic, which, as the name implies, is just echoing stuff. So, you see it with kids all the time, like you'll say ball, and they say ball back, and the function is essentially mimicry. Why am I telling you about all of this? Because in Skinner's initial conception of language, it was a combination of these four aspects of verbal behavior that he proposed led to the development of human language and cognition. So the idea, I would show you videos, but they're not playing, so I'm just going to skip them. The idea was that the first thing that we learn is basically echoic responses, where basically I can echo back verbal responses that you say. So over time, you will say, cup, and you're holding a cup. And initially I just go cup, I'm just saying it back, echoing. Over time, that can turn into, for example, manding, because I have now learned reliably that in the presence of me, this, when I hear cup, this is the SD controlling that response. So then, I might be inclined later on to start manding and basically saying cup to gain access to that object. And tacting also related to this because me saying cup is also a tact for this cup. Does this make sense? Mostly? Okay. The good news is you don't need to worry about this too much because it's not a it's an okay account of verbal behavior, but it's incomplete in a few different ways. The main one being the Chomskyan episode, let's say, which I'm sure you're probably all familiar with. So if you're not, basically Skinner published his book Verbal Behavior where he proposed this account. And Chomsky gave quite a scathing review of the book. And the main criticism of Chomsky was that Skinner's ideas that I just mentioned didn't account for the generativity of language. So for those of you who have kids or interact with kids, you'll know that around 2 years of age, there's like this language explosion. So initially they've been kind of manding, tacting, it's all been very directly trained, and then suddenly there's a whole verbal network that emerges. They start using new words with very little instruction. They start kind of making connections between things and learning basically how to communicate. So radical behaviorism then is at a bit of a crossroads. So Chomsky did mischaracterize a lot of radical behaviorism, but he did have that one point, which is the generativity. So behaviorism, from that perspective, explains the ways in which specific words acquire meaning through direct training, but not the ways in which we learn about never before experienced words or concepts. So this is this kind of direct experience versus indirect experience divide. When we talk usually about operant and responding conditioning, we have changes in behavior that are the direct result of learning. You experience some consequence or some contingency, and it leads to a change in behavior. But human beings also have this incredible ability to respond however you want, symbolically or indirectly, without actual contact with those contingencies. So, for example, you're online shopping, and you have to make a choice between products after reading a bunch of product reviews. Now, you've never experienced any of the products that you've looked at, but your behavior is under the control of the product reviews. So your behavior towards those products change, even though you've never actually experienced those products directly. So this takes us into the realm of verbal behavior and to what Jan was talking about before. But this is the history that leads us to there. So along came stimulus equivalence theory as this kind of revolutionary new way of thinking about verbal behavior from a behavioral perspective. So what does this look like? Well, let's imagine I've got Bob here. He's Pigeon, he's my best friend, I love him to pieces. And I take Bob and I put him into a Skinner box, or an operant chamber, as people prefer to call it. So, my little friend Bob is in the operant chamber, and on the wall, at the back of the operant chamber, I project this image at the top of the wall. And then there are two little buttons, one on either side, and just above each button are these two other symbols. So, Bob comes along and he pecks. So Bob comes along and he pecks this symbol and he doesn't get any food. Then he comes along and pecks this one and he gets some food. Then maybe I switch them around, but the point is I always tie this symbol, this discriminative stimulus, the SD, to responding to this stimulus, and it leads to food. So Bob can learn that no problem. Bob is a smart guy, and pigeons actually can learn to discriminate between abstract art. They're very, very clever. But then I say, okay, Bob, I'm going to push you because you're such a smart little guy. I said, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to flip these around. So now, Bob, instead of this being the SD, the stimulus that's presented at the top, my peace sign is now presented at the top. My Buddhist symbol is presented at the top. My peace sign is now one of the options you can respond to. And now I take Bob and I put him back in the chamber and I show him this for the first time. He's never had experience of this particular arrangement before. And Bob responds randomly. He just doesn't get it. He doesn't see that these things function equivalently. He doesn't, for whatever reason, he's not able to respond as if this is equivalent to this. So by virtue of this now being the SD rather than that, makes him clueless. Now, I take my other little friend, who's actually a human baby, who's also called Bob, because why not? And little Bob here, who looks like he's leaning on the bar asking for a drink, is in a much more comfortable operant chamber, and it's all plush and comfortable walls. And he gets the same thing, so he sees a little peace symbol and he gets two options, and sure enough, little Bob, he's real smart, he learns how to do this too. But now, when I do the same thing that I did with Pigeon Bob, Baby Bob responds reliably straight away without any training. The only training he's got was in the previous arrangement. So Baby Bob is able to respond equivalently, even though Pigeon Bob is not. And this is a really replicable phenomenon. Human beings from a very young age can reverse these relations, like little Bob did, but other animals can't. In fact, no other animal can do this, especially in this way where it's arbitrary, as Jan mentioned before. There have been people who tried to do it with dolphins, pigeons, and rats, in I think monkeys as well, but systematically nobody finds it. So this was an exciting discovery, and it seemed like it could maybe bridge that gap that behaviorism was missing in terms of understanding the generativity of language. So, animals doesn't work. So, after a bunch more research, this guy Murray Sidman published this book called Equivalence, Relations, and Behavior: A Research Story. And the core premise was this triangle. So, you get direct training in, say, A as a discriminative stimulus for the response B, just like the arrangement showed you just there before. And maybe you also get direct training of A as a discriminative stimulus for the response C in some other context. So, those two thick black lines are the only direct training that a person might get. And what happens is, you get this reversal like we showed before. So B functions as an SD for A without any direct training. C functions as an SD for A as well. This is all what we said before. But what also happens is that B can function as an SD for C, even though they've never been put together in the same ratio before. So now you've suddenly got a very generative behavioral model of how people learn, because you can derive relations between stimuli that you've never experienced before. And this ability to derive suddenly starts to seem like, okay, maybe we can make a model of language from a behavioral perspective of this. So think, for example, of the spoken word cat, the physical cute little guy cat, and the written word cat. Now, if I teach, say, a child, okay, this written word, this is equivalent to cat, maybe because I hold up a little sign that says cat, and then I point to the little cat over there. And then maybe whenever we see this cat, I'll go, cat. I train these two direct relations, then suddenly all of these derivations come too, without any need for direct training. You can think of this also in terms of learning other languages, or even, your first language. If I tell you that, let's say, I'm going to use dog because I can't remember the Irish word for cat, that I tell you the word dog is equivalent to the Irish word madra, which is the word dog, which is equivalent to the Dutch word hond, then all of a sudden I learned that hond means dog, even though I've never put them together. You guys with me? Okay. So, then we get to the arbitrariness of these equivalence relations. So as I said, the relation between the stimuli is arbitrary. Jan has already covered this, so I'm actually going to skip past it basically. So, stimulus equivalence was very exciting. The next thing that came along was relational frame theory, which in simple terms basically blew stimulus equivalence up even more. Because, imagine, for example, instead of just learning the two things are equivalent, I tell you that my buddy Homer here is older than Lisa. I hope everyone knows The Simpsons. And if not, actually, this is great because you're going to learn a lot about them. So Homer is older than Lisa. So however you want to phrase it, like more age. So. And then I tell you that Homer is younger than Abe. So this is the same as that direct training thing, except now instead of them being the same or one functioning as an SD for another, it's a different type of relation. But with just these two exemplars, these two pieces of information from direct training, of course you guys already know that Lisa is therefore younger than Homer, Abe is therefore older than Homer, and also that that Abe is older than Lisa, and that Lisa is younger than Abe. So, notably, it's not just that the relations are the same, but rather that one relation implies some other relation which may or may not be the same. In this case, they're actually kind of opposite. Rather than being the same, one is older, one is younger. Does it make sense? Okay.
It might be important to again emphasize that these are patterns of behavior.
Yep.
This is not knowledge source. It's not that you infer relations. It's you behave, you show a pattern of behavior. All of this fits in the class of behaving as if Homer is older than Lisa. It's a class of behavior.
That was this slide here. Remember that none of these explanations invoke internal mechanisms. They're all descriptions of functional relations in the environment and their impact on behavior. I hope that's clear.
I'm confused, Jimmy. I'm sorry.
It's okay. What have I confused you on?
I don't understand how the relationship between Abe, Homer, and Lisa translate in your brain. So how? Yes.
Yeah.
So what's your claim here? That if my behavior is
okay. Let me remove The Simpsons because I was just trying to be funny. Let's imagine instead that I tell you that, let's imagine this is dog number 1. Okay? So dog number 1. So, and I tell you that dog number 1 is bigger than, hold on, let me think for a second. Yeah, okay. Dog number 1 is smaller than dog number 2. Okay. And I tell you also that dog number 1 is smaller than dog number 3. So if this is the smallest dog and these two are both bigger. Right. And then let's imagine, so then you can derive a relationship between dog number 2 and 3, even though I've not told you anything about them together.
And regulation is not the inference. There, that's the confusing thing about word derivation. Because he hears they infer.
Well, let's say I don't need to talk about inferences. What I can say is just that if you have a really negative experience with, say, dog number one, let's say dog number one attacks you. Okay. And now you already know that dog number two is bigger, right? And I tell you, and let's imagine now, like, you've essentially been, through operant conditioning, you find a stimulus really aversive, and you've got avoidance towards it. If I tell you that dog number two is in that room over there right now, and I'm going to bring him in, then you will emit responses as if you had experienced dog number two, even though you haven't, and your response will be impacted by the functional relationship between these two things. As in, he's bigger, so you're going to have an even stronger reaction to dog number two, even though you've never experienced the dog, you've never even seen it. Now, I suppose this is the key thing, right? From a cognitive perspective, you immediately jump to this is a mental representation of dog number two versus dog number one. But my point here is mainly that you need not invoke those things in order to still functionally describe what's happening. You don't need to talk about this in terms of mental mechanisms.
Yeah, I think the step here that you have to make as a psychologist is that if you go back to the equivalence triangle, so at some point in time, people have learned this, that acting as if A, B, and C are the same, that this means selecting B in the presence of A, C in the presence of B. All these choices belong to a set of behaviors saying we act as if they are the same. So whenever you learn something new about one thing, you act in the same way towards another thing. You have learned this behavior of acting as if things are the same. It's a really abstract form of behavior that, just like imitation, you can apply this to any situation. To any type of stimulus, you can start acting as if two things are the same. Just like you can start imitating, you can apply this to any type of stimulus. And there are cues telling you, okay, now apply this behavior of acting as if things are the same, apply this to this situation. And once you have done that, then if you go back to the ABC, so for some reason there is a cue that A is equivalent to B and B is equivalent to C. Then part of the behavior of acting as if A is the same as B and B is the same as C is selecting C in the presence of A. You've never done this before, but you have done in the past. In the past you have treated other objects equivalently. And now you're transposing that learned behavior of acting as if those stimuli are the same. You transpose this to a new set of stimuli. And so, even though you have never trained the selection of C in the presence of A, because you transpose the abstract behavior of acting as if things are the same to this new situation, you start emitting behaviors that you have never trained in this situation. That you have never trained with these stimuli. You get what I'm
because you can also, like, in the same way that you can look at the functional effects level, for example, and that it's good to parse the effect from the proposed mechanism, you can also look at what's happening here in terms of functional environment behavior relations without invoking mental mechanistic explanations.
So, I'm not sure I understand it. Maybe I can tell you one, but so in this case, the point is that one type of learning is that in the presence of A, B and C are equivalent. No, shit.
No, so throughout my learning history, I had many of these examples. I had this with the word class, object class, and the word there. For example, three stimuli, and I learned what it is to act as if these things mean the same thing. And one of the ways, one of this is to select the word class for class. I've done this for every word you can imagine, for every type. So I've had a huge training history for acting as if things are the same. And one way of acting as if things are the same is to select one in the presence of the other.
Selecting the whole class of the whole bottle.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what we mean with selecting.
Yes. Yeah. So this is just one way as acting as if things are the same. Acting as if things are the same also is that even one stimulus requires a new function, and I act as if another stimulus is the same as that stimulus with a new function, then that function also transfers to the other object. So if I learn that object A is a predictor for a shock, I also, and I'm acting as if A is the same as B, then I will also act as a B predictor. So the function of the transfer of function is also part of the way as acting as if things are the same. And I've learned that many, many times. If I learn that, word class is of course difficult, but if the object class predicts a shock, I'll also be afraid of the word class. And because in the past, equivalent objects tend to have the same function. So I've learned to act as if things that are equivalent respond equivalently.
So if you say of a dog, I've been bitten by a dog, then you say dog.
Yes.
Right? And I get scared as if I was in front of a dog.
If I in the presence of the word talk, also negative, you've learned basically that things can be equivalent. You've learned what it is to act as if things are equivalent throughout a long learning. And then you come to an experiment. You see, you have to select B in the presence of A, and you have to select C in the presence of B. And what happens then is at that point, the person basically starts acting as if this old behavior, this known behavior of acting as if stimuli are equivalent, is now applied to this new circumstance. That's the really important point. It's an old behavior, acting as if things are the same. You've learned that in the past, but you need to have cues to apply it to the present situation.
So acting as if things are the same is a behavior learned throughout the history of learning. It's not a mechanism of learning.
Yes, no, it is a behavior.
It still confuses me a bit.
And it is a behavior that is shaped up step by step by step.
Yeah.
Actually, people become excellent in acting as if things that they are.
But what you say is that this behavior is not a mechanism in the same sense of conditioning.
No, because that's a strange thing. From that perspective, conditioning becomes a behavior.
Yeah.
That's really mind-blowing if you start thinking about it that way. Conditioning is no longer conditioning because the parent is simply a cue for that behavior. I know this is stretching it, but that's the implication. Pairing is no longer a direct cause of a change in behavior. The pairing has a function of the textual cue to arbitrarily reproduce.
So rational responding is a different view on all behavioral mechanisms that essentially translates them as not as mechanisms but as learned behavior in this unified framework.
So basically, arbitrarily applicable relational responding is an operant behavior. And it has been learned as you learn every other behavior. But once you have the ability to respond in relationally in an arbitrary way, then this basically transforms your whole world because you're no longer responding to events as simple things, you're responding to events as cues.
So my being vulnerable condition, that classic condition is different than a tox with vulnerable classic condition because I respond to, I have this interoperability of, I don't remember the whole name, of arbitrary representation.
We can call it R-ing. R-ing. Because it's A or R, so we call it R.
R. Okay, that's good because I also love R. So
yeah,
so it's because of R that my metrics have been transformed to
the function of your parents has changed.
Yeah.
Okay. So the parents for a verbal human being, parents function as a cube. Whereas for a non-verbal dog, the parents might function as a dagger, cross, and they have different functions. It's still in both cases conditioning, but the function of it, because there's an impact of the parents on the behavior, but the function of the parents is different.
function. Okay.
Yeah. It's only for verbal beings that the parents are a contextual relation.
I'm going to push on here because I'm 20 minutes. I just want to get to the ACT bit because I'm done with this bit. I really tried not to use the word operant, but it actually turned out to be helpful rather than. So, just to piggyback on that, in the way that you can act as if, you can act as if things are equivalent. You can also act as if they are more or less than. You can act as if they came before or after. Act as if they are something is contained within something else, or many other ways of relating things. Okay, and the way in which you relate those things impacts how the function transforms. So if I say this dog is equivalent to this dog, and you've never experienced this dog, you're going to treat it differently than if I say this dog is much smaller than this dog. Okay? Okay. So, now that I've lost everyone, let's just skip through into the ACT bit. So, what is ACT? ACT is the third wave of behavioral therapy. So, the first wave of behavioral therapies was like sort of SR, kind of simplistic ways of doing kind of behavioral therapy. Second wave is usually considered to be things like CBT, things like this. And third wave is usually considered to be therapies like acceptance and commitment therapy, functional analytic psychotherapy, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and other types of therapy methods. So it's a third wave therapy. It's just the wave in which it was developed. And it has two key principles. It's functional, because it focuses on the functions of behavior, just like we were talking about, and it's contextualistic, like Jan mentioned at the end of this thing. Everything is contextual. So what functions well in one context may function not well in another. Everything is determined by this interaction context. And it's somewhat derived from relational frame theory, the thing I was just talking about. So I say somewhat because the main tie is that the guy, Steve Hayes, who kind of pioneered ACT, is also one of the main guys who pioneered RFT, and it does have some links, but there's also some, they call them mid-level terms, which are basically like not fully bounded from RFT, but that they use as kind of bridging terms, and it's a whole controversy in debate. So it's derived from relational frame theory, certainly. And the main idea of ACT can just be summarized by this little comment here. So you can't get rid of your fears, but you can learn to live with them. That's the acceptance part. That you can basically recognize thoughts that you have and change your relationship with those thoughts. So let's talk about this link a little bit more. Okay, so you've got to listen intently to the sound of my voice. It's very exciting. Okay, so are we ready? My mother-in-law is from the south of Italy, and she grows the most amazing fruits and vegetables. I remember the first time that she gave me one of her lemons. It was huge, gleaming, bright, golden yellow like the sun, and such a delicious, zesty aroma. And as I ran my fingers gently over its skin, I could feel every tiny dimple in its surface. I took that lemon and I squeezed it in half. I held it up and I opened my mouth. I squeezed out the fresh lemon juice right onto the tip of my tongue. Okay. So, did anyone feel anything from that? Did anyone have, when I talk about rubbing your hand over the skin of the lemon or the taste in your mouth, did anyone have any like responses to it, like salivatory responses? Yeah. anyone kind of have the sort of almost simulated feeling of that touching the lemon? For me, that image of like the bumps over the lemon is very evocative. Now, even though you're not directly having contact with that beautiful, beautiful lemon, through what we would say derived relational responding or Ring, you likely have some kind of, let's call it an evoked response. So the function of my verbal behavior has been transformed by your previous experiences, so that when I say lemon, you think about almost experience an actual lemon. In the same way, the function of many stimuli in our lives can be dramatically transformed through derived relational responding, through this ability to relate stimuli in different ways and have those functions transformed. And that's basically the premise of ACT, is you base it on that, and then you think about, well, what's the dark side of language? What are the ways in which this ability can affect us in ways that are less than beneficial to us? So this is one example here. I'm not going to go through them all because we don't have time, but just to take one example here. Imagine you have a client in therapies experiencing extreme distress at what was, at the time of making these slides, the recent war in Ukraine, still recent. So life during COVID was really difficult, but I got through it by telling myself, at least it's not a war. Then a war comes along, and by establishing this verbal relation between COVID and a war, and this comparative relation of saying, well, what is essentially saying COVID would not be as bad as a war, which would be terrible, and then having then the direct experience of the war transforms the function of that in a way that may not have been the case had you not had that pre-established verbal relation. Does that make sense? No? Yeah. Oh, it does, okay. Julio, you're my litmus test here. So. Okay, so I'm going to skip these other ones. Say, kind of draw a comparison between the CBT point of view on things like this and the ACT point of view, just to give some context. So the CBT point of view for things like this, experiences of psychological distress, would be, aside from the behavioral part, and we mainly focus on the C bit, would be to address any kind of faulty, incorrect, or maladaptive beliefs that people have. So if you have a belief that something like, I'm worthless, you have this recurrent thought that I'm worthless, life is not worth living, whatever it is, then from a CBT point of view, you would try to address that belief head on. You would basically try to say, well, no, look, that's, try to prove it wrong, basically. See what I mean? From an ACT point of view, you would take a different approach. You would not be able to get rid of your fears, but you could try to learn how to live with them. So an ACT practitioner would say, we have negative thoughts. We have really horrible thoughts as verbally able human beings. And we can try to struggle against them, but ultimately that can be quite difficult. And what can be better is that we transform our relationship with those thoughts. And there are a bunch of different ACT exercises that people in ACT try to do to try to transform those relationships. So we're going to do one now, actually, called cognitive diffusion. So remember the lemon that I mentioned before, okay? Now, what we're all going to do collectively, it's going to be really awkward, but just bear with me, is we're going to say lemon all together for 20 seconds, okay? Again and again and again. So, are you guys ready? Okay. 1, 2, 3. Lemon, 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 lemon. Okay. Now, does anyone have did anyone have any experience of kind of change across saying lemon there? Did you notice anything change while you were sort of doing it?
Now the lemon is my overlord.
Your overlord. Did the let's say the effect that it had on you change? Like what most people would report, and I hope that at least some people had this, because otherwise they're going to have to go talk to the ACT people, is that when you repeat a word like this over and over again, what eventually happens is you move away from its conceptual meaning more towards its physical properties. So you start to notice more the feeling of saying that word in your mouth in terms of, kind of the sensations that you feel, rather than in terms of the, what's it? Oh my god. Lemon. Rather than in terms of the sort of more derived properties. You actually lose contact with those derived properties and keep contact with the more arbitrary physical properties of the word. Did anyone have that experience? Yeah. Okay. Well, one person did, it's fine. If you're curious. Again, I'm not an ACT practitioner, but this is one of the exercises that people do. And by bringing words like this or concepts like this into focus in terms of their non-arbitrary functions rather than arbitrary functions again and again and again, the idea is that you basically diffuse those relations from those negative functions. So that's one technique. Another technique is acceptance, which is basically to essentially stop struggling against negative thoughts and instead to kind of feel them as they rise up and as they fade away. I want to do a little exercise related to this and also related to metaphor and analogy. So I need a volunteer from the audience. Would anyone like to? Maureen, you will. Come on. I already told her she'd have to do this. So this is another exercise. Just come up here. Another exercise that people can tend to do. So this little guy is you. That pit is unending pain, and this guy is me with my cool tattoos, right? So we're standing over a pit like that, and I'm pulling on a rope. So here you go. So we're pulling on a rope. Don't pull too hard, because this is my charger. But let's imagine that we have this pit here, okay? So I'm going to pull you into the pit. So what are you going to do? You're going to pull back. If you pull back, okay, stop. No, okay, try again. I'm trying. Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, that's good. Now stop. But it's coming back again. So what are you going to do? Okay, just don't go back. All right. Okay. Let's try again. What are you going to do? Okay, you're stronger. Okay, don't break my cord. Okay, so we're still pulling. Okay. So I'm the anxiety monster, right? And I'm coming back to you again and again and again, and I'm pulling at you. Okay, I'm pulling you into that pit, and you can pull back, but I'm still pulling. Now, does this feel good when you're pulling? No, it doesn't feel good, right? Do you enjoy this? Is it a good time? Aside from being here? No. Okay, so what could you do instead that might be a little bit more enjoyable or might relieve some of this tension? Drop the rope. Exactly. So, this is one of those ACT exercises. You can see that there's a lot of externalizing, a lot of literalizing, and that's on purpose because the idea is that you move away from arbitrary stimulus functions towards non-arbitrary ones, because when we have non-arbitrary ones, they're more manageable, we can deal with them more directly, and we can transform the meaning and our relationship with our thoughts in terms of analogy and metaphor. Now, does this work for absolutely everything? No, but certainly for distressful, acute feelings, it can transform your relationship with how you think and feel. Having said that, I don't do any of this personally, so I don't know much about that. Okay, so the final point to flag in the context of ACT is to really emphasize this idea of the self as context. So the idea, again, this removing yourself or changing the relationship between you and the negative thoughts and feelings. So it's an exercise called the leaves on a string. We're not going to do it now because it's all hippy-dippy. But what you usually do basically is you will be asked to close your eyes and you will be asked to imagine your thoughts as leaves floating by on a string. And they'll ask you to watch what happens with these thoughts as they float by. And you might notice that you get fixated on some of those thoughts, they kind of stay for a little bit, then they float away, others come along, some move by very quickly, and then you'll build this up a little bit more with the client, and then you'll ask them, now, who was observing all of those thoughts? And they'll say, I guess I was. And then you'll say, okay, so you are not your thoughts. You are a context that experiences thoughts as they move by. And some stay for longer, and some stay for less time. But the stream continues to move. And it's this idea, again, about transforming the function and relationship between the self as context and your thoughts. So all of these are very, I know, like, kind of they sound a bit new agey, maybe they are. But these are the type of exercises that ACT therapists use with the idea of changing the relationship with the thoughts. So does it work? Like every other therapy, it's pretty hard to say for a bunch of reasons. One of the biggest ones, there's huge heterogeneity in terms of how it's implemented. You have this with CBT trials as well. You try to do a trial with CBT, you get 60 practitioners, each one's CBT looks completely different. Where is the true CBT? It's a graph. There's a wealth of evidence for the behavioral principles behind it, so in terms of like reinforcement, punishment, these principles that we've talked about all day, basically. There's a wealth of evidence for the right relational responding, human beings' ability to do this. We can, say, do you need a cognitive explanation or not, something else, but certainly the functional phenomenon is well documented. As for evidence for ACT's effectiveness, there is some evidence for its effectiveness with some things, mainly like depression and anxiety. A lot of people do experience comfort or a change in their relationship with their thoughts that's very beneficial. And then there's also less evidence for its effectiveness in others, and some null results too. I can't remember which. They've done some things that I think are a bit crazy, like in very sort of acutely endangered patient groups and things, which I don't think that's the place for this kind of therapy. But yeah, there's less effectiveness for it in other contexts. So, fully radical behaviorists to sum up, would recognize the inherent limits of clinical intervention on individuals as well, so that you're always going to be bounded in some way when you try to intervene in this manner. Because as individuals, we live in a society that puts us into certain contexts that we might find immersive, and while some of those contexts we might need to change our relationship with, that doesn't mean that we should also accept really kind of unacceptable context, essentially. So I would emphasize that ACT isn't incompatible. Like accepting negative thoughts and changing your relationship with them shouldn't and doesn't necessarily need to change how you view social issues and things like this. It doesn't mean you should disengage with them. There's this common expression in ACT that life is full of pain and it's unavoidable, but suffering is not on the screen, but suffering is not inevitable. Suffering is, pain is related to the effect of the environment and the world on us. Suffering is related to our relationship with our thoughts. But even if we should sometimes accept pain in this way and try to reduce suffering, we can do that as an individual, but as a society, we shouldn't. There was actually just recently an article I saw this morning in The Guardian. I'm a psychologist, and I believe we've been told devastating lies about mental health, which was basically about this exact point, which is about how sometimes we can use psychological interventions in a way that almost de-emphasizes the role that the broader social context plays. So, as a radical behaviorist, I felt the need to also just throw this in. So, to summarize, naming is not explaining what behavior is. Radical behaviorism is not methodological behaviorism. Relational frame theory extends this behavioral kind of language, and Julio, I hope I'll be able to explain it to you properly someday. ACT harnesses this RFT conceptual language and delivers a new type of therapy, and the logic of therapy should not preclude striving for better material